Hello and welcome back. So we're talking today about the Axial Age, which is very interesting. I mean, it's a broad period of time. Um, my head is over the right side of this graph here, but it starts at 800 BC-ish and ends around 200 BC. So it's a span of about 600 years. You see all those little green spots there. Those represent, revolutionary new religious movements that arise around the same time, in a historical scale, right? You've got philosophy arising in Greece, you've got Buddhism, you've got Confucianism, and Taoism as well. In India, you've got Hinduism developing out of the older Vedic religions. And then in the Middle East, you got Judaism coalescing into something we might recognize today as a monotheistic religion. So a lot going on all over the world, seemingly, unaware of each other, and yet uh, moving in a similar direction, right? So it's fascinating, and we're going to talk about it today. So as I said, no one knows exactly why all of these religions developed in, roughly the same time. It doesn't seem, I mean, I suppose it's possible that over hundreds of years, people from China could somehow travel or get information from the Middle East and vice versa. But it's interesting at any rate. So uh, but as far as we know, there wasn't a great deal of trade or communication, between China and Israel, and nonetheless, they're making parallel developments in religion. What was certainly going on at this time was a new sort of social order. A new class of merchants was beginning to emerge and gain power, and the priestly class was beginning to diminish in importance. So you had the emergence of maybe what you call a middle class, or at least a new source of wealth, and people's reliance on priests to govern their lives became a little less important. But begins, all of these Abraham, and then Homer in Greece, who's the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Again, they're not sure if he's a real person, just like they're not sure about Abraham. Um, that stuff, that sort of mythic era, the kind of last mythic era, happens around 800 BC. So that's what we're calling the beginning of the Axial Age, and it marks the end of that world, of these characters that the names have come down to us, but it's not exactly clear if they're historical or not. And it marks the beginning of the historical era where we can start to say with more certainty, okay, yeah, this king that's written about on this particular clay tablet was a real person. So in this period, many religions that are still recognizable today began. Hinduism in India, Buddhism as well in India, Confucianism in China, Greek philosophy, Zoroastrianism in Iran, which we won't spend a lot of time talking about. It pops up in some versions of Christianity that are influenced by Zoroastrianism, so it will get mentioned later in Christianity, but we're not going to have like a unit on Zoroastrianism. And then the monotheistic Judaism. These all these all arise during the Axial Age. And they have something in common in that they all point in the direction of a more monotheistic and more abstract sort of power behind the universe. They're moving away from this loose collection of deities that all kind of personify, various natural forces, a sky god, a thunder god, and an earth mother, and into something, you know, more like what you and I would recognize as God, right? A single, omnipresent, omnipowerful force that is the source of all existence. So we're going to pause in the Axial Age and kind of jump around the globe a bit and look at this development um, before we eventually return back to Israel and see how, the God that most of us are familiar with of Judaism and Christianity and Islam developed in a little more detail. So in India, there was a polytheistic society. So there was a indigenous population that was invaded by the Aryans in 1600s BCE. You may have heard of the term Aryan uh, in the context of Nazis, right? They called themselves Aryan. They are hearkening back to these people. It's not clear the Nazis really understood the actual historical Aryans. I mean, it's a long time ago. Nobody really does. But it's not clear that they were somehow, a blonde, blue-eyed race of Germanic people or whatever the Nazis envisioned Aryan to mean, right? But that is where the word comes from. Um, so the local Indians were conquered by the Aryans, and they had their own religion, the Rig Veda, and it was polytheistic, um, similar, generally to the ones we've seen in the Middle East, right? There's animal sacrifice, in order to try to convince these gods who govern nature to help you out and maybe get some rain for your crops. But things started to change in India around 700s BCE. So that's around the time J and E were writing their histories of Israel that would later be joined together into the Bible we know. The indigenous religion that the Aryans had suppressed was beginning to be sort of revived and also reimagined. So one of the original concepts in the indigenous Indian religion was karma. Um, so karma was sort of reintroduced around the 700s BC into the popular imagination as this sort of force that governs the universe. But what's special about karma is it's kind of rational, right? Uh, you may have heard of karma as like, oh, if I do something bad's going to happen to me. If I do good things will happen to me. Um, that's roughly correct, but it's in the context of reincarnation, right? Death and rebirth, and it's not so much that well, I've heard it described not so much as some magical force that, if you harm somebody, then you'll get whatever, lightning will strike you, but more like um, if you do negative things, that will create a tendency in you to do more negative things. And engaging in negativity will just bring negative things around you, right? And so it's almost like a psychological sort of thing, but it does also um, come back to you not just in this life, but in the next life as well. So you maybe when you're reborn, you can kind of either move up or down the chain of being. Humans are towards the top, right? To get here, you would have probably have been, reborn as started as a snake and moved up to, a pig and so on. Uh, but karma is the universe is long lasting for the Hindus, and one of my religious philosophy teachers described the chances of being born a human as the chances of a turtle popping his head up in the middle of the ocean and happening to stick his head through a life preserver that was there from some random ship. Very low probability, right? And so it's a long, long series of rebirths as turtles, and uh, over and over again, right? So that's the idea of karma, right? It was starting to get popular. And instead of these sacrifices to gods, instead yoga was becoming more popular as a practice for, in a sense, mastering the spiritual realm, like getting some control over the way your life goes by mastering your own mind, right? So it becomes uh, less physical, it becomes more abstract, right? And more spiritual, maybe more psychological. And less attention was being paid to gods, in this rebirth of Hinduism, and instead was being paid to sages or wise men who could guide you in spiritual practice. So these people would write, right? They would meditate, they would practice yoga, they would write about the nature of the universe, and these teachings were collected in treatises um, that are known as the Vedanta. The Vedanta has uh, several parts, right? It's a collection, so you've got the I'm going to mispronounce these, right? Aranyakas and the Upanishads. Um, and these explain sort of some of the deeper meanings. They're more philosophical, the underpinnings of the sacrifices and rituals that they had been doing for centuries. Now they're putting them in a philosophical context. In particular, the Upanishads, they developed the notion of the divine called Brahman. right? And Brahman is just this force. It is the source of all being. It is in everything. It's what we call immanent in everything, right? It exists everywhere, um, but it's also very abstract. Not much can be said about it. It can't really be described in human terminology, and yet it is everything. Brahman also is the name of the priestly class. So Brahman is the universal force that is the source of all being. Is also the name of the people. There is a caste system in India, and Brahmins were at the top of it. You may have heard heard of untouchables, right? That's the lowest class of people, this lowest social class in India. The Brahmins were also a social class. Um, but Brahman, the god, is not quite like a traditional god. It's not the sort of god that you could pray to and ask questions and ask favors of, and it doesn't sit down and speak to you like Elohim. Um, Brahman isn't partial to, the Israelites or any particular tribe or group of people. It doesn't get angry when you disobey it. It doesn't love you when you, worship it. It is just this source of all being. So everything that exists comes from Brahman. It's a manifestation of Brahman. You are Brahman. I'm Brahman. My computer is Brahman. And not much else can be said about it. It's beyond language. Right? Um, Brahman exists in each person, and in that form, in you, it's called Atman. So one of the ways that sages would try to explain this notion of Brahman, which can't be explained, is through stories and parables. So here's one uh, from Hindu teachings. So a young boy asks his father where God was, right? And his father looks at him thoughtfully. Rather than answer him directly, again, because it can't be described in words, he asks his son to mix salt and water in a glass. So right, the son dissolves up the salt in the water. He asks his son, taste the different parts of the water in the glass, right? Taste that little part. Now taste the part, right? Drink from the bottom, right? Now take a little sip from the top. Um, and see if you can separate the salt from the water. And the son will say, no, I can't. All the parts of the water are equally salty. I can't separate the salt from the water. And the father says, son, just as the salt cannot be separated from the water, but is present throughout it, so Brahman is both everywhere and separate from the world. Brahman cannot be separated from everything. Right? Brahman exists in everything, dissolved throughout it. Right? I don't know if it helps or obscures things, but that's the sort of thing that they use to describe Brahman. So this is not I've described the Upanishads and these teachings as philosophical. That may be a slight misnomer. It's certainly not in the way that the Greeks approached philosophy. Um, so it's not that it was a rational thing that you could somehow deduce the existence of Brahman from certain premises or through scientific investigation or anything like that. Um, the way people find out about Brahman is through spiritual experience, religious experience, right? And in order to have such an experience, typically you need a regular spiritual practice, a yoga and meditation, and then all of a sudden something will overcome you, right? A feeling, a revelation, and for a moment you will sort of glimpse the nature of reality and the nature of Brahman. Is not, again, a thing you can talk about, it's a thing you can feel. So another quote, God comes to the thought of those who know it beyond thought, not to those who imagine it can be attained by thought. It is unknown to the learned and known to the simple. It is known in the ecstasy of an awakening that opens the door of life eternal. Again, so it's not something you learn because you're really smart and you figure out the nature of Brahman. It's something you have a profound experience, now reveals a reality to you. So it was in the context of Hinduism in India that Buddhism appeared. So Siddhartha Gautama was raised in the 500s BCE. So Hinduism had been around now for a couple hundred years. Uh, in the next lecture, I have you watch sort of a YouTube video that's kind of cartoony, but does tell the story of Siddhartha, which because it's a good story, and it can be told better than I can, in a little more exciting way than I can tell it. But the broad strokes are Siddhartha was a rich guy, a rich kid. He grew up in sort of a walled little fortress or mansion. Um, Lived a life of comfort and was going to grow up to be an upper class gentleman. When finally one day he leaves the walls of his palace and sees a sick man, right? He sees an old man. He sees the reality of life and is overwhelmed uh, with despair, right? Uh, and completely decides to abandon his life of wealth and seek the truth. And so he wanders around for a bit, studies with various gurus, but no one can really satisfy him. And sort of at the end of his rope, he kind of gives up and he just sits under a Bodhi tree, not knowing what else to do. So he just sit there for days and days, right? Um, and to his surprise, after a while under the Bodhi tree, he has a deep religious becomes enlightened. And there he understands finally the nature of human existence, right? Its trajectory, its goal. He understands the point of everything. And so the Buddha comes to understand the nature of human existence, and that nature can be encapsulated by these four noble truths. So the first is dukkha, the fact that all of life is suffering. Um, samadaya, that the cause of this suffering is desire, right? So it's interesting, but if you think about it, it makes sense. So, um, when I suffer because I'm frustrated, maybe I don't get a good enough grade in the class or something like that. The suffering is caused by my desire to get a good grade, right? If I didn't care about getting a good grade, then I wouldn't suffer when I didn't, right? So the Buddhist analysis of suffering is that it's the cause of us wanting things, and then our wills getting frustrated. Uh, Nirodha, the third noble truth, is the fact that suffering can be eliminated by eliminating that desire, that attachment, right? If I'm not attached to anything in this world, then nothing in this world can disappoint me or cause me to suffer. And finally, Marga, the eightfold path, is the way to eliminate that desire. So again, it diagnoses the human condition, which is just all suffering, uh, locates the source of that suffering, right? So suffering can be eliminated, right? You just eliminate the desire, and then gives you a technique for eliminating that desire. So this brings us to the Eightfold Path. So these are the ways of life, right, that will eliminate desire if they're practiced, and thus eliminate suffering. So right view. So um, this means you need to understand the nature, right, of the universe, of the human condition, understand the nature of karma in particular, that your actions will have effects beyond your death. So the goal, what eliminating suffering looks like, is through successive rebirths, eventually getting out of the our universe altogether, right, into nirvana, sort of a perfect nothingness, right? It's to end the cycle of death and rebirth. That's the goal, and that's how suffering is eliminated. And since karma fuels the cycle of death and rebirth, you need to understand about karma and how you can uh, practice good karma that will facilitate your getting out of this world. So, right resolve, which is being committed to living correctly, right? So, um, nonviolence comes up over and over in the Eightfold Path. That often involves forms of vegetarianism, right? So, no violence against any life form. Um, that's bad karma, right? Certainly against other people. Uh, and in general, to leave the ways of the world, right? So, if you're out there in in the business world trying to get rich, trying to having kids, right, and being worried and desiring great lives for your kids and stuff, that's all you're being sucked into this world of desiring and attachment, right? So um, living correctly for the Buddhist is checking out from all of that. Right speech, so basically if you don't just chatter, right? Avoid idle or negative speech. Certainly don't gossip. Don't speak ill of people, but don't speak at all unless you have something useful to say. Right conduct, again, no violence, but also don't pursue sexual desire. Don't pursue wealth. Uh, Again, so in what you resolve to do in the second part of the Eightfold Path. Now, in the fourth part, you actually engage in that and conduct your life in that way. Right? Avoid violence, avoid attachment to worldly things like sex and money. Right, livelihood, right? So you do need to survive. Um, Buddhism doesn't necessarily advocate just sitting there and doing nothing and starving to death, right? But if you are going to earn a living, do it in a way that is correct, right? Don't get involved in violence, even against animals, right? So don't work in the meat industry. Certainly don't work in the military. Probably not in politics either, and so on. Right effort. So guard your sensory doors, right? So against unhealthy inputs. Right? So where does desire begin, right? Sexual desire, where does it begin? You see someone desirable, right? And this stirs desire in your mind. So avoid that sort of stimulation, right? Attachment to delicious foods, right? Attachment to money. You see something you want, uh, and then the desire starts to work its way into your mind. So guard your guard your mind through your sensory uh, apparatus, and try to make sure that nothing that might evoke desire uh, gets into your head. Right, mindfulness. So this is about being in the present, right? So you want to be present and be mindful. The past is gone. Don't dwell on it. The future is come, right? Again, don't thinking about, oh, I hope that, this thing works out right. I hope I get a good grade in this class. I hope the stock I bought does well. Your head is in the future. You're in the world of attachment and desire. Uh, if you are right properly Buddhist, whatever happens in the future will be fine because you have no particular attachment to any particular outcome. Right? And then right samadhi, so meditate regularly, and that's one way to attain this attachment. Now, it may seem sort of anti-life, right? It seems like you're just trying to check out from everything. Uh, you're not mistaken to thinking that, but there is also a tendency in the Buddhists to say, once you've mastered this stuff, um, the goal is not simply to check out from life, but once you can live correctly without attachment, then joyful engagement with the world is recommended, right? So now that you can go through the world without being jerked this way and that by various desires, you can get into the world and live correctly and good. So again, the idea that, as I mentioned, right, karma has us locked into this cycle of rebirth, and the Buddhist is trying to get out of the cycle. You can travel up and down the cycle depending on your karma in this life. If your karma is not so great, it's going to bump you down a notch in the next life. Um, right, by living right, you can bump your way up the karma, and uh, again, it's tough, right? This goes on and on for thousands and thousands and billions of years. Like the time scales mentioned in Hindu mythology and stuff are like way beyond like what science thinks like the Big Bang was, right? Like 4 billion years is nothing in the time scale of the Hindu universe. So, cycle of karma can get you trapped for a long, long, long time. Um, and it's very likely that, even though you're a human right now, you'll kind of screw it up in this life, and maybe next time you'll be a raccoon, and then you'll have to work your way back up to a human thousands of times before you can advance. It is possible, right? If you follow the Eightfold Path, you can beat the odds and escape being altogether. Universe altogether. It's an unbeing. Be free from the pain and the suffering of life. So notice I haven't mentioned any gods, right? Now, the Buddha exists in a Hindu context, and there are lots of gods still floating around. Um, and he's not saying don't believe in the gods. They just don't have a very big role in Buddhism. They don't really help or hurt either way. Um, Enlightenment is not some sort of interaction with the gods, right? It's not some sort of something that the gods give you. It's something you can do on your own. And Siddhartha isn't the god of Buddhism. He's just one person, but anyone can be a Buddha. And according to him, in the Buddhist tradition, there have been throughout all time and into the future many people who haven't gained enlightenment and are Buddhas. So there are multiple Buddhas. And Nirvana isn't heaven, right? Certainly in the Christian sense, total lack of self. It's not that you right go to Nirvana and you have your same memories and your same thoughts, and you sit there in Nirvana thinking, Jesus, I'm this great, I feel great, right? It's a total annihilation of the self. I'll describe it as the blowing out of the candle. Right? So it's non-being. Um, Remember, death for the Buddhist isn't an escape. You'll just get reborn into a new body. So to finally escape, you need something new. You need nirvana. And so that's what nirvana is. Um, and it can't really be put into words, but it is the end goal. It's perfection and total peace. So now, zooming across the globe over to Greece. Around the same time, right, that the Buddha was alive and teaching, uh, a Greek philosopher named Pythagoras. He's what we would call a pre-Socratic. So um, Socrates, I don't know if you've heard the name, kind of marks the beginning of Greek philosophy um, and the death of sort of mythological thinking. But there are philosophers before Socrates who are sort of a mix of, Pythagoras. You may have heard the Pythagorean theorem, right, of how to figure out the length of the hypotenuse of a right triangle, right? So he's doing mathematics and geometry, um, but he's also doing some kind of mythical, mystical stuff as well. By the time we get to Socrates and Plato, it's a little bit more reliant on logic and rationality, although not entirely. But he did heavily influence Plato. So everything we know about Socrates, we know from Plato. Socrates never wrote anything down. So even though again, Pythagoras is called a pre-Socratic because Socrates is kind of the dividing line of like what counts as philosophy. Um, it's really Plato, right? Because everything we have from Socrates, we mostly have from Plato. Um, but Plato's influenced by Pythagoras. So Pythagoras, um, like the Buddha, did see human existence as an inferior form of existence. He did believe in a form of reincarnation as well. There's been speculation that he somehow had heard about Buddhism, or maybe had traveled to India, or somehow was influenced. The similarities are interesting. Um, in Pythagoras' view, uh, we originated as a part of a divine reality, right? A reality behind our reality, and that through a series of rituals, purifications, and understanding of mathematics and things like that, we could return to the divine realm. Uh, like Hindu Brahman, this is not God like we think of him today. It was not in any way anthropomorphic. It was uh, some deeply abstract, deeply mysterious notion of the divine that Pythagoras thought we might return to. So Plato then is kind of the first philosopher that wrote anything down that we recognize today as a philosopher that's still taught in sort of introduction to philosophy courses. Um, One main difference between his approach to understanding the nature of reality as opposed to like the Hindu approach is that he used reason. Recall I said to experience Brahman, right, was just a religious experience you got from meditation or something like that. It wasn't something you reasoned through. Plato, everything is rational and logical. So, um, so Plato is what we call a rationalist. Um, he recognizes that senses are prone to error, right? So, um, I might view uh, I'm looking at my computer screen right now, and from the angle I'm viewing it, it looks like a rectangle. But if you were standing, at a different angle, it would look like a rhombus, right? Each person has sort of their own perspective, which makes this sensory information sort of less incomplete. There's also the fact that at any moment you could be dreaming and you wouldn't know, right? So there's always a chance that your sensory information could be mistaken. And anyways, all the worldly things that we see with our senses are also very impermanent, right? They're constantly changing. One day the apple is green, then it's red, and the next day it's brown. Um, so Plato was very skeptical of the sensory world, and instead thought the only sort of permanent knowledge was knowledge that came by pure reason. So, mathematics and geometry, uh, 2 + 2 equals 4. That's going to be true throughout all time, right? In every universe, everywhere. Um, he also thought, I'm trying to condense this, right? So we did recognize, um, even though the world of horses and apples and chairs is impermanent, we can talk about apples and horses and chairs, right? And we can understand each other. So where does that come from? Given that all the actual horses and apples and chairs are constantly changing, right? And each one is different than the other. And he decided that when we talk about, earthly objects like horses and apples and chairs, um, we're talking about the forms. It sort of corresponds to what we would call a concept, right? You have a concept of a horse that is distinct from any particular horse, right? And it's through your concept of a horse that you're able to communicate with other people about horses and their concepts. So um, Plato basically thought in order for us to be able to really be saying we understand exactly what each other are saying and be talking about the same thing when we talk about horses, we must both have access to a sort of rational horse, right? What he calls a form of a horse. And it's the ultimate, right? The abstract concept of the horse. So this is the world of the forms. And he says, well, for every sort of um, thing that we can talk about sensibly, um, it must exist in the world of forms. But the world of forms is distinct from the world of real horses. Uh, it's a non-spatio-temporal realm that never changes. And so uh, this world of the forms, it's not heaven, right? It's not Brahman. It's something else that he's deduced rationally, right, from certain uh, um, basic premises, right, about our abilities, our rational abilities, and he deduces that there must be this other world where the forms exist, but it's not. And he also thinks that when we're born and we die, our souls must exist in that world as well, right? Because to have knowledge of the world of the forms, we must have been there, right? We must be remembering the world of the forms. So there is a kind of Pythagorean dichotomy between this perfect world of the forms and our imperfect world of the senses. Um, that kind of mirrors that Pythagorean approach, but frames it in an entirely logical sense, right? Plato, if you read Plato, he will give you arguments to establish the of the form, not some sort of mystical experience. So one way he tries to describe this is in the allegory of the cave. So this is a famous passage in Plato. This is sort of a metaphor for human existence, right? And our attempts at knowledge. And he says, imagine a race of people that live deep in a cave, chained to a wall, um, and in the dark, and all they ever see are the shadows cast by the world outside, right? They take those shadows to be reality. So a bird will fly by the cave, and they will see a shadow of a bird, and they say, "Ah, a bird," right? Um, they might even try to understand the regularities of the shadows, right? Oh yeah, the shadows always seem to, move continuously across the cave, and things tend to fall down but never up, and things like that. Um, you could even come up with a science of the shadows in the cave, uh, but all this ever is, it never really touches on reality, right? It's just an image. Um, it's just a reflection of reality at best, right? And so that's he says the human condition. We're always behind this veil of perception. Our sensory experiences don't get at reality. At best, they sort of distantly hint at reality. If you've ever seen, The Matrix or one of these movies where it turns out that everything has been a dream or everything has been an illusion, it's kind of the basic idea that Plato's getting at. So, the state religion of Plato's time was a polytheistic religion of Zeus and Apollo and all the other Greek gods, Hera, and so on. Socrates was eventually executed, right? So he was put on trial. The charge was corrupting the youth and inventing new gods. Uh, and he sort of denied that charge, but he was nonetheless convicted and died by drinking hemlock. They offered him a banishment. He said, "No, if I can't hang out in Athens and do philosophy with other Greeks, then I don't even want to live." So he drank poison hemlock and died. So later Jewish and Christian thinkers found Plato very attractive. Right? They thought, yeah, maybe there is, this polytheism is not correct, and yeah, maybe there is one God and a divine reality, and so on. And so they would often, even though what Plato talks about the world of forms, it sounds nothing like the God of the Bible. Later thinkers would try to. They loved how rational and logical Plato was. They tried to map it onto Judaism and then later onto Christianity, and have sort of a logical, rational versions of Judaism and Christianity. So we'll see Plato coming back and back throughout the years in the development of these religions. So Plato was a pupil of Socrates, and then Aristotle was a pupil of Plato. And Aristotle uh, was not so much a rationalist. He was an empiricist, right? So he was more like a scientist like we would see today, where he did say, well, yeah, no, the sensory world, the senses do give us access to the world, and if we can observe regularities, we can learn about the world. Um, he wrote a famous book called Metaphysics. It's just called the Metaphysics. You may have heard of metaphysics. It's like spooky, right, way out there sort of philosophy. Metaphysics just means after the physics, because he wrote a book called The Physics, and later people who were editing his works, they said, well, he wrote this one after, so we'll just call that one after physics, right? So that's all metaphysics means. Um, and it just so happened that that book focused on issues of the origin of the universe and the nature of God. And so Aristotle does have something to say about God. He thought that there must have been a beginning to the universe, right? So the way I like to think of it is like, if you give me $5, I could ask you, where did that $5 come from? And you might say, oh, well, it came from, from Jim. And well, who gave Jim that $5? Well, it came from the store. And where did that come from? And you could trace it back. And eventually it would have to come from the United States Treasury. It wouldn't make sense to say, oh, it goes back in an infinite chain, right? There's no beginning of the $5, right? That would seem insane. And that's what Aristotle thinks about the universe. He thinks, well, it can't just go back forever into history, infinitely. Um, there must have been something to start it. And the thing that started, right, what he calls the unmoved mover, the thing that set the whole universe in motion, that's God for him. And he doesn't say much else about God. God is just a placeholder, right, something had to start the universe. We'll call that God. Right? So kind of like Brahman. It's not a God that's going to answer your prayers or, get involved in helping your crops grow. It's a very abstract thing. But that is the God of Aristotle. Now, later is particularly Islamic uh, thinkers, and then it moved into Christianity. They also liked Aristotle a lot, right? They also latched on to Aristotle as well as Plato. We're going to talk more about natural law theory later, which is kind of still exists in the Catholic Church as like the basic metaphysics, um, derives directly from Aristotle. So um, Aristotle was a bit of a scientist, but his ideas of sort of causation and forces were slightly different. So he thought not only is everything, have a physical composition that explains, what it does and why it moves, everything also has a function or a purpose, and that also explains its motion. So um, rain falls to the ground because it's for plants to grow, and plants are on the ground, right? And plants are for animals to eat, and animals are for humans to eat and use for other things, and humans are for thinking, right? Since humans are distinctively rational, that's what makes us different than cows. The purpose of humans is to do philosophy and so on. So everything had a function, and this is very attractive to the Christian thinkers who thought, well, yeah, God designed the whole universe, and God, right, gave everything a function, right? So they just sort of later Christian thinkers took Aristotle's worldview and just added a omnibenevolent, all-powerful God on top of it.